Hello, and welcome to At the Movies with Mike and Marie, a show where two film professors talk about movies. I'm Marie Westhaver.
And I'm Mike Giuliano.
And today we're going to talk about No Other Choice and 28 years later, The Bone Temple.
28 years later, The Bone Temple. Got it.
And we will talk about why that is such a clumsy title when we get to it. But first, we're going to start with No Other Choice, which is a Korean film by Chan-wook Park. And it is an amazing film about capitalism and over-identifying yourself with your job. But Mike, where do you want to start?
Well, let's start with the director himself. Park Chan-wook is one of the best-known South Korean directors, and he really first came on the international scene with a film called Oldboy, which is really violent, really tough material, and is so polarizing. I have some friends and students who love it, others who can't tolerate it, and it's all over the place. And then films since then, like The Handmaiden, I mean, he's got a track record there, but he's known for edgy material. So this is the guy who's both directed and co-wrote the film we're talking about here. And Marie's absolutely right that it's very much a sort of dystopian workplace story. And in terms of similar things, you might, in terms of Hollywood films, think about like Michael Douglas and Falling Down. For instance, what if you're a corporate worker and you've been downsized and your life goes into a downward spiral? It's that kind of a story. In terms of how it affects the family dynamics, you might think of actually a very well-known film and prize-winning film, Bong Joon-ho's Parasite, even, in terms of pressures on a family, at least in a general sense. Now, specifically in terms of this film, it's actually, when I mentioned a Hollywood film, it's not so far removed from American cinema in various ways because it's based on a 1997 novel by Donald E. Westlake called The Axe. And since we're talking internationally here, that book itself was already turned into a film by Costa Gavras in 2005. So there's a track record for this film material as well. But cutting to the chase here in terms of the specific story, Marie's absolutely right that this involves a longtime corporate employee. Indeed, he's worked for a paper company for 25 years. And the reason why the paper production seems to be like a particularly apt choice for a career here or for a theme in the film is that when you think about it, the raw materials that go into making paper, but so often almost everything produced on paper ends up as trash. And indeed now, the guy who makes it or oversees the making of it himself is sort of being treated that way. So once the company makes its corporate decision, in terms of downsizing, this guy really is distraught. I mean, economically, his life's been ruined. And the film has a dark sense of humor about that in terms of, well, do we have to sell this or do that? And, those are very serious issues, but they're often treated with some degree of humor in the film. For instance, when they talk about the ramifications of this, one of the most horrifying for them is that they'll have to cancel Netflix. And so when that gets mentioned, it's like, oh, no, not Netflix, too. And so, there's a kind of winking acknowledgement that way of the fact that, we're watching a movie and we're all about movies here. Now, I don't want to spoil anything in the plot, but let's just say that Man-soo, our protagonist, ends up taking some rather extreme measures by way of payback, essentially, what he's going to do to get back at people there. And a lot of that really is extremely violent, certainly emotionally and physically, and it's just very disturbing, but oftentimes treated almost in a slapstick sense. And by that, I mean, like, he's rather new at this payback game. And so he's kind of bumbling with a lot of it. And we kind of laugh at that a bit, too. So the film is walking a sort of queasy line of like funny, not funny. And that's quite interesting. Now, for me, where the film ultimately was a bit disappointing, and I know I fixate on running times, but this film has a running time of 139 minutes. And in talking with critic friends, they tended to agree on this point. Much as we like the film generally, it's very strong in some ways, the plot tends to meander. It follows, this character and a few others, family members, colleagues, and it goes off on these tangents sometimes. We're not quite sure where's it going to head next. Like, is this another storyline to follow? And then sometimes it just abruptly drops something, like a character or story strand just kind of drops out. What I said to a friend was, this is a potentially really strong film. It would benefit from another edit, from really tightening up the material, and then you really would have a powerful film. So with that, let me turn it back to you.
Completely agree about the runtime. I will always agree that I think it's just lazy to make things not fit into 2 hours. I mean, I just think that's really important. Yes, some stories need more elbow room. I mean, I get it, but I just feel like we talk about this all enough that obviously people making movies think it's fine to let it ride. I think people find it annoying, and I think it keeps people from sticking around to the end credits because they got to get to the bathroom. So that's enough of a reason to not make your movie too long.
Well, we've talked about it for 139 minutes on occasion. I mean, we've
We
belabored the
have.
point. And it's a shame here because he's got all the elements for a really strong film.
Hmm.
There's so much to admire here. We haven't really talked yet about the characterizations, the acting, but it's really top of the line that way in terms of how well made it is. It's just sometimes that can be ironically a mixed blessing when a filmmaker is so talented, just to keep giving you more, and instead of like pulling back a little bit and streamlining somewhat.
Well, what's interesting is that he takes it in his head that what he needs to do is eliminate the competition. And what's so ironic and what makes the movie kind of work for me is that these are all men who are basically just like him, trying to be the last man standing. So you get the job means, you kind of have to, I don't know, metaphorically go after yourself to be the last man standing.
This is a phenomenon certainly in many cultures. So I don't want to peg it specifically to Korean, but in Japanese culture, for instance, there's that figure, the salary man. It's the strap hanger who's on the bullet train heading into Tokyo. He's reading a manga or something there. He's got his briefcase, and who's really devoted to the company, and like for life. And it's as strong as a marriage in a lot of ways. And this is, I would say, the Korean equivalent of that. What's your sense of that, Marie? Because the moment I watched this film, I thought I could identify, because I've seen enough Japanese films, and Korean for that matter, where there's that as a motif or as a character trait. And it seems to me that's something, a really strong thematic element in films from that part of the world.
I'm glad you brought that up because I actually had written a note about that. That is it really this lucrative to be basically a salary man at a paper factory? All of the characters you meet, the main character and the other men who he's in competition with for, the rapidly depleting number of jobs, they all live in really nice houses. The concept that this is a good job is underscored several times, and also the fear that these positions are few and far between, and that these people are so invested in this industry. I mean, likening everything they talk about to paper, knowing paper so intimately. How do you start over?
Well, that's a really good point, because one of the strengths of the film is that it understands that business, whatever combination of experience or research they had to do here. And so when the guys stand around talking about paper, if they're talking about the competition and they're making fun of it or trying to knock it down a notch, how do they do that? Well, the paper they use or the paper they make. And they go into, like most films would just have it as a passing reference. Here it goes into some detail, which actually, not that I'm obsessive with it, but it is really interesting to say, well, the way they make their paper, and then they go into it's a kind of lived experience quality that is to the benefit of the film. The other really important point you make there is that so often one might think, well, if you're an average worker and suddenly you're out of work, struggling to put food on the table, all those issues, and there's sort of either a middle class or lower middle class or even working class type pressure there. This is actually interesting in the sense that you're absolutely right, Marie. We don't get actual salary figures, but these people are living comfortably. They have really nice houses. And that's where the anxiety is more at the other end socioeconomically of the upper middle class. We are accustomed to having Netflix. You're accustomed to having a nice car, everything in the house. And then, when it gets to the point of, do we need to sell furniture even? What do we need to do here? The anxiety is the same for them in many ways, but for them, it's a matter of they've been so accustomed to living a well-cosseted life that the prospect of having to go down a few pegs is really making them as anxious, I think, as it would make someone who's working class, who's really worried about, paying the rent and food on the table. From their psychological perspective, they see it in equally frenetic terms that, their life might be falling apart here. And that's an interesting dynamic, because when you have them expressing that kind of anxiety, meantime, they're sitting in a very well-appointed living room, and you realize, well, but from their perspective, this is a crisis. And so I'm not at all being sardonic with that. For them, it really is a major change in thinking. And that's a difficult adjustment to make for them. And so when the guy pursues this path of a kind of payback, as Marie says, these unemployed or guys are competing for what few jobs remain, what hasn't been automated, what hasn't been turned over to AI or robots, the fact that they're all, you're right, sort of in the same situation there. And I think there's a degree of empathy, of sympathy. So if you ask me straight out, do I approve of some of the things this guy will do? The moralist in me would say, well, of course not. You shouldn't do that. It's illegal or certainly unethical. And yet we've built up a degree of empathy with him where we're siding with him and somehow feeling sorry for him to some extent. And maybe, yes, extending a certain amount of latitude there, as in, well, the guy he did this to was not such a nice guy, or this is dog eat dog kind of conditions. You got to do things, to get by. And what I'm getting at is it makes it easier for the audience to rationalize some of the decisions that otherwise seem, unacceptable, really improper. And also, doubling back on what I said before, it lends the film to oftentimes a surprisingly comic tone. It's often, I wouldn't exactly say lighthearted, but it often, will have you smiling, if not exactly laughing out loud at some of the stuff that happens here.
Actually, I think it's very darkly funny, and it would have been interesting to see Alfred Hitchcock take this material on, because of course it would have been completely different, but just to handle some of the moments where you think, I can't believe I'm laughing, but here I am laughing. So there were two things I wanted to ask you about specifically, and here's the first one. The main character has a toothache, and he keeps coming back to that. And by the way, the teeth and the wrench thing, it was like, oh, right, this is the director of Oldboy. By the way, I'm a big fan of Oldboy, as gory as it is. But he will occasionally, he keeps touching his jaw, reminding you of the toothache. And then he'll say something like, I'm a family man, I'll find a job. So he's clearly connecting the pain he's experiencing physically with the psychic pain of feeling like he's letting down his family.
Well, yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because yet another strength of the film is that sort of psychosomatic element where when you have that sort of mental pressure, it will manifest itself physically in various ways. For one person, it might be like nervously tapping a foot or something like that, or facial twitches or whatever. In his case, there is the toothache, there's that whole aspect of it. You could have that under any condition. If you need to see a dentist, you need to see a dentist. But again, thematically, psychologically here, the fact that, he's feeling the pain. And so the actor in performance, like periodically, like, the hand to the jaw, that kind of a thing. So even when it's not actually said out loud, there's an awareness of this guy's in pain. It helps to keep the film grounded that way, as in, you could get that toothache at any time, but ironically and aptly here, the fact that, that's going to hit you just at the point where you are mentally suffering as well. So yeah, from mental suffering to physical suffering.
Now, also, I noticed like there's an apple tree and a snake in their garden, right? So, I mean, I get the reference that, once you have knowledge, there's no going back. But did you pick up on that? Did that strike you as key to, just sort of plot metaphor development?
Yeah, I noticed it. And frankly, it struck me as perhaps a little bit of thematic overkill. It starts to get a little heavy or a little hokey, or maybe a little bit too much stage management with something like that. I wasn't bothered by it, but it seemed to me that was something that either was extraneous or could have been, because I'm not sure we need that much underscoring on the point.
Now, their daughter is a cello prodigy. And I remember when Departures came out, there was all kinds of discussion about the use of the cello in that movie. And one of the reasons for the choice was apparently the cello sounds the most like a human voice singing. Do you think there's anything crucial about that detail that she's a cello prodigy?
Well, it's something that filmmakers are keenly aware of. When I think of many of the chamber dramas, as I like to call them, of Ingmar Bergman, how often you'll have that sort of mournful cello music coming in at a certain point, because there is a human voice like quality there oftentimes. I mean, first of all, just in terms of, orchestral scoring or cello scoring, the fact that you can really achieve a melancholic mood very quickly with a cello, that really emotionally bolsters what you're trying to convey at that point. So in this film, the child does study the instrument. And this is, again, a case where it's an upper middle class anxiety they have, because the girl is talented, somewhat withdrawn, doesn't want to perform in front of them and so on, but clearly is serious as a student. But of course, you have to pay for the lessons. So then it's a matter of, well, she needs another music teacher, but, the one music teacher saying, but the other one's going to cost more. And you get into those pocketbook issues of we love our child and we want her to advance as a student, and the teacher saying she should go to the next level of teaching. But gosh, that's more money that you'd have to pay for it. So again, those are some of the incremental details that help to make the film not only convincing, but really emotionally moving, as in, well, these are decisions you'd have to make week by week. What do we do here in terms of the daughter? But yeah, I think you're right about, of all the instruments to study, I think it's best for her to study the cello. The movie would have a bit different tenor, a different tone if she decided to study the accordion, for instance.
Or the flute.
Yeah, well, just think of instruments where, I'm not sure it would, first of all, it could drive the parents batty to have some of those instruments being played, Lady of Spain on the accordion. But the point here is that, this is a carefully crafted film, and I'm sure decisions like that were really thought through very thoroughly, because those scenes work extremely well.
They really do. Okay, so we need to move on to 28 years later, The Bone Temple. And in order to really give this, its due, do you want to do like a quick reprisal of the whole 28 franchise? Because there's several movies involved.
Yeah, it's true. And like you, I have to always carefully check the titles to make sure I've got them straight, because it is like that. Now, this franchise, by way of genre, it's a post-apocalyptic zombie movie, and goodness knows we've had a lot of those. But this is one of the better franchises within that genre. So it actually goes back as far as 2003 with 28 Days Later. And these are, I'm sort of old school with zombie movies. I mean, I go back to like George Romero, Night of the Living Dead. I want my zombies to be slow moving, ghouls, right? That's personal taste, if I can put it that way. But in more recent zombie movies, they tend to move really fast. And in this case, it's justified in various ways, but one of them being, they are infected, and the infection has them acting out in all sorts of horrible ways. And so I can see that. And also, I think audiences nowadays, and I'm on a soapbox here, but audiences really want to cut to the chase very much in terms of violence and action and so on. And if it takes a zombie like a half minute to walk across the cemetery lot, isn't it better to have him run across the cemetery? So that may be the ultimate reason for this. But in any event, it goes back to 28 Days Later in 2003, which is it's a strong film. And then that led to a sequel in 2007, 28 Weeks Later. So I've got my titles straight so far. And then last year we had 28 Years Later. And now the film we have presently for discussion and on screens, 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. This is being envisioned as the middle segment in a trilogy. So the film that came out last year, this one, and actually without spoiling anything whatsoever, and it's no surprise that franchise films set up the next installment, this film very much sets you up for what would be the third film in a trilogy. It's a lot of, a lot of zombie action here. And may I go on? I'll go on anyway. Well, let me turn it over to you, because I've been chatting a bit. Why don't you pick it up at this point, and then I'll double back.
Okay, well, I full disclosure, I do not like zombie movies because, I don't get it. I don't understand how you're supposed to kill the undead. There's always something about it that just, I cannot, fully accept the premise. So I am not the audience for this movie. And I just want to let people know who also don't really like a lot of violence. All of the films in this have their moments of extreme violence. Eyes being gouged out, people's heads being ripped off. You have to have a strong stomach for that kind of thing because it is going to go there. Having said that, that's not all it is. It has lots of things to say. And I wondered if in this current installment, what you thought about, I don't know, some of the things that I thought, are they trying to make something out of this? I mean, we're at the point where the apocalypse has dragged on long enough that people are actually, creating religious cults and, rebuilding civilization. And there's a whole group of children who have survived or born into this who are part of a cult called the Jimmies, and they reminded me so much of the Teletubbies from the intro, the very first scene in the original movie, and also Jimmy Savile. Mike? I mean, did you pick up with that? Just the fact they were called the Jimmies, they dressed like Jimmy Savile. It was kind of about corrupted childhood. Am I reading too much into that, or was it obvious?
You're reading everything into it that you should there, because the character's name is Jimmy Crystal. He's played by Jack O'Connell, who he's a good actor, but think about how typecast he's made himself in a way. He's one of the vampires and sinners. You know, he's playing like not just bad guys, but really bad guys. In this film, he's sort of a charismatic, almost Christ-like figure, although he calls himself the son of Satan, so he's the Antichrist, if anything. How seriously to take that? I mean, for me, it's just a lot of hooey after a while. The fact that he is a British audience would identify more immediately than an American audience here, but you absolutely picked up on this, that Jimmy Crystal essentially is a highly exaggerated and distorted, but somehow true to life depiction of Jimmy Savile, who was a BBC host who got into a lot of trouble, certainly posthumously, when things were revealed there. And it really was a huge story, and still is, in the UK. And that's why enough Americans would know about it, actually. And the character is very much built on that connection that's being made. A lot of that was so extreme by way of a kind of religious cult that he leads that, you know, it's oftentimes funny. And I put quotation marks around funny just because it's like so out there. And this is where the film bothered me, actually, a great deal. As in all the earlier installments, as Marie mentioned, you expect sadistic violence in a film like this, but it's so extreme, it's so relentless, and it's pushed to such a far edge that I think the film itself is what I call borderline camp. It's almost unintentionally, well, not unintentionally, it's intentionally funny. But for me, there's a point at which it's no longer scary in the way it should be scary. It's just silly. And I'm kind of laughing it off. It's almost like the screen version. Remember Island of Dr. Moreau? It's that kind of a film where it's like so out there. It's like you just sort of hoot at it. And for me, that really bothered me in the film after a while, that it was really reveling in the sadism and treating it as comedy. And I was really turned off after a while. I was never bored by it, because it just really, it's like the gross out moments kind of hold your attention. But I really thought the film was morally bankrupt in a way. It's not often I get so puritanical with something, but I really thought that the film was really lacking a conscience in a certain way. It was just like really reveling in this awful material in a lot of ways. So you want to pick up on that? Because I agree with you that this film, you know, there's a lot of smarts that went into making a really stupid film.
Well, I think we need to talk about Ralph Fiennes, because he plays such a pivotal character and such a different character, in that he, instead of approaching the people who are infected or the people who aren't, he sees the humanity in everybody. And we haven't seen that happening in the other movies, because everybody's, you know, losing their mind, either trying to avoid the zombies or they are zombies and are on a rampage. I think he is fantastic in this, and kind of gives the movie some hope, but it is sort of a bleak hope, because he is somehow marginalized in the end, even though he's got the right idea.
So much of the film's strength, and it does have strength in play. I mean, on a technical level, it's very well made.
Very well made.
When I say it has strength, if you want to like watch it scene by scene in terms of camera work, editing, building tension, it's really, really astute that way. Even though I don't like what I'm being shown, and, you know, again, give it its due there, that it's a very well crafted film, and also, you know, the performances really are strong as well. Jack O'Connell, who plays Jimmy Crystal, much as we might despise the character and thematically kind of scoff at it and all, it's really I'll call it a lived-in performance, which I'm not sure I'd want to accept that compliment that he's so convincing as Jimmy. But Ralph Fiennes, really, it's an absolutely terrific performance. It's such a great performance. And whatever reservations I have about the film otherwise, he anchors it emotionally. And you're right, he does give it some genuine humanist value. And within the film, you know, he plays Dr. Kelson, who's been studying this infection and maybe working towards a cure. And the good doctor befriends one of the infected who's aptly named Samson, who really has a Samson build. And he's wondering if maybe he can not only sort of bond with this infected person, but maybe even cure him. I think, speaking of borderline issues, I think it's sometimes borderline hokey that way, to the extent that there's a Hallmark card moment, when the two of them can sit down next to each other and kind of emotionally, humanly bond. And I mean, that gets pushed kind of far, and I'm not sure I'm convinced by it particularly. But the fact that it's much needed in this film to offer something, it's that proverbial glimmer of hope that maybe humanity has a chance, and maybe the infected and the uninfected can get along. Can we all just get along here as human beings or quasi-human beings? And again, even though it sounds like I'm making fun of this, I mean, I think that's a hopeful strand in the storytelling. How well it might emerge in the third installment in this trilogy, of course, remains to be seen. But between the glimmer of hope offered by Dr. Kelson and one of the child characters who becomes a protagonist, certainly throughout the film, you think there might be hope for humanity. Whether there's hope or not, we know we're getting another film in the franchise, so that hits us anyway. So again, mixed and negative feelings about this film, but props to actors who really are first rate. And we haven't mentioned the director, Nia DaCosta, yet by name, but she does have technical chops, as they say. She had directed Candyman and had, and as a filmmaker, definitely has talent. The genres she's worked in and some of the material, as Marie said earlier, may not be to all tastes, but, on a technical level, she knows the craft of filmmaking. What do you think?
Yes, I thought she did an excellent job. It's beautifully edited. All of the special effects look super realistic. No, she definitely she brought her A game. So I don't know who they're going to have direct the next one, which will probably be like, 28 eons later? Where are we now in that sort of timeline? This movie is also great if you watch the first one and you wanted to know what happened to the kids, because it obviously does jump ahead and let you know that answer. So final thing, Mike, the title to me makes it seem like you're going to watch some sort of Indiana Jones thing.
Well, again, and that's a dicey proposition in a film like this because, Bone Temple, it actually, visually, these are arresting images. When you have a temple built of, human skulls and other bones and things. But again, it does, I think, whether intentionally or not, prompt me to start thinking, of an Indy Jones type thing. And I'm not sure that's the vibe I really want here. If you're really going to seriously deal with this material, to kind of wink and nudge and giggle a bit there. And it's one reason why those scenes that should have been terrifying, really, and I'm visualizing them as I say them, they really weren't that scary for me ultimately, because I had that sort of, oh, come on reaction. Like, well, how many hours did it take you to build that tower of skulls? And I don't want to have, those are distracting thoughts, right? I don't want to have thoughts like that while I'm watching it, but it just seemed like a production design on overdrive at that point.
I completely agree with everything you just said, but that does bring us to the end of this episode. But don't forget to check out our other episodes at atmhcc.podbean.com, and we'll see you next time at the movies.
See you then.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed what you just heard, we have a whole universe of podcasts waiting for you. Simply search Dragon Podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. You can also explore our full lineup and discover new shows at podbean.com/dragonpodcasts. That's podbean.com/dragonpodcasts.